Welcome all. My name is Steve Bromage. I'm the Executive Director of Maine Historical Society. We're glad to have so many of you with us tonight for this program in our Maine at 200 series. We've got a really fascinating topic tonight. This year, of course, has been dominated by the coronavirus pandemic. It has defined the experience, health, work, education, family life, and psyche of all Mainers, all Americans. 2020, of course, has also been the bicentennial of Maine's separation from Massachusetts and statehood, a moment to look back at the roots and foundations of contemporary Maine. We know how this bicentennial year has gone. The first case of the coronavirus was confirmed in Maine on March 12th, which was 3 days before the actual 200th anniversary of statehood. Early on the morning of Sunday, March 15th, the actual 200th, I found myself sitting on Crescent Beach in Cape Elizabeth, looking out at Richmond Island, which was one of the earliest places in southern Maine settled by Europeans. Richmond Island was a fishing station in the 1630s, and I can't be at that beach with family or without going back to 1630s or before, as much as I'm trying to recreate. But on that day, I was sitting there, as this pandemic had just arrived and we were all heading home from our offices and wondering what was going to happen. And I was just struck by the irony of Maine marking its bicentennial with a pandemic, given what a fundamental role that previous pandemics had played in European settlement of Maine. Starting in the 1520s, multiple waves of epidemics of smallpox, measles, influenza, and the plague brought across the Atlantic to North American by Europeans decimated indigenous populations. Scholars estimate that anywhere between 20 to 60 million indigenous people died in the years following the European invasion, up to 95% of the population of the Americas. I think those numbers really put the coronavirus into some perspective for us. It was disease and pandemic far more than military force or any other factor that weakened indigenous people's ability to respond to, resist, and defend themselves from the arrival of Europeans. We are really fortunate to have James Eric Francis Sr. with us tonight to help us explore the impacts of those previous pandemics had on Wabanaki people and communities. Now, James is very special to us. James has been an essential advisor, collaborator, and partner to MHS in our efforts to commemorate Maine's bicentennial and do all kinds of other work. One of the principles of MHS's approach to the bicentennial has been the belief that it would be impossible and inappropriate to consider statehood without first and always placing it into the context of the experience and ongoing presence, leadership, and stewardship of Wabanaki people. James was one of 7 Wabanaki curators who helped MHS imagine and create the exhibition Holding Up the Sky. His knowledge, artwork, and perspective were featured throughout. James has also served as an advisor on our second bicentennial exhibition, which is currently on view, State of Mind Becoming Maine. His monumental painting, We Walk On Eternally, a recent MHS purchase, greets visitors as they walk into the gallery in that exhibit. James is the Penobscot Nation's tribal historian and director of cultural and historic preservation. Prior to working at the Penobscot Nation, he served with the Wabanaki Studies Commission, helping to implement the new Maine Native American Studies law into Maine schools, and managed a team of teachers and cultural experts in developing a curriculum. An historical researcher, photographer, filmmaker, and graphic artist, Mr. Francis co-produced a film, Invisible, which examines racism experienced by Native Americans in Maine and the Canadian Maritimes. Also of note, James is a lifetime member of Maine Historical Society. Thank you. James, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us this evening. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Steve. I hope you all are having a good Veterans Day, honoring all the warriors. So, I grew up on Indian Island, which is a small island in the Penobscot River, and it's the home of the Penobscot Nation. I went to Indian Island School, which at that time was run by the Sisters of Mercy, a Roman Catholic sect of nuns. And it was started in about the 60s, late 60s. The nuns were our teachers. The school and the church were really inextricably linked. We used to walk from the school to the church for things like First Communion and other church traditions. It was part of the school curriculum. This walk would take us past the cemetery that I have never entered, which is kind of strange for a historian in the community. The Down Street Cemetery, as my grandmother told me, was full of cholera. When we entered St. Anne's Church, one of the longest continually operating sites of worship in the New World, we would pass a small statue just inside the door. The statue was of a beautiful Native American woman with a crossed crucifix hanging around her neck. Her name was Kateri Tekakwitha. She was baptized with the name Catherine, but was also known as the Lily of the Mohawks. She was born in 1656 in a Mohawk village on the Mohawk River in present-day New York, someplace between Schenectady and Cananjohari, right along I-90 today. By the age of 4, Kateri was left scarred by smallpox, a disease that inflicted and killed her whole family and much of her village. Badly scarred, she took a vow never to marry and dedicated the last 5 years of her life caring for the sick who were inflicted by the same disease, smallpox, that then she was immune to. She died at the age of 24 in the Mohawk community of Kahnawake, near Montreal, Canada. The Vatican later canonized her, and today she is known as Saint Catherine Tekakwitha. So, as a youth growing up on Indian Island, I was introduced to the devastating tolls that disease had on not only my community, but on all Native American communities. During the first few decades of the 1600s, the Wabanaki communities were beginning to deal with the boatloads of explorers darting up and down the rivers of Maine. The English looking to settle and trade, the French looking to trade and convert. French Jesuit priests brought over as early as 1604, set up camp in and around Wabanaki settlements. Through contact with these foreigners, Wabanaki populations began to decline due to sickness. In a 3-year period from 1616 to 1619, an estimated 75 to 90% died from European-introduced diseases. It was guessed from the written accounts that this disease was smallpox. 75 to 90%. What does that mean to a Wabanaki community at that time? Well, first of all, it meant loss of their faith in the healers, the medicine man, the shamans, if you will, who had no power to combat these diseases that they had never seen. They also lost faith in the leaderships, the chiefs and the Saugams had problems. And they lost the ability to live as they did traditionally. At the time, Wabanaki societies were mobile, moving inland from the sea in the fall moons to hunt and harvest in kinship groups, readying supplies for the long winter. Because of the carrying capacity of the land, each kinship group had their designated hunting grounds, gathering grounds. Some families traveled hundreds of miles up rivers and streams to these places in the fall. This model relied on all members of the family to pull their weight and contribute to the whole. Losing 75 to 90% made living traditionally nearly impossible. In addition, as people were getting sick, the Jesuit priests, the black robes, were there and remained healthy. Being European meant being immune. These priests used the situation to increase their numbers of converts. There are many examples of deathbed baptisms, and for those who did survive the disease, were convinced that it was the conversion that saved them. Many more converted. The Great Dying wasn't the first epidemic to wipe out tribes. It's well documented that the Pilgrims that landed on Plymouth Rock in southern New England first settled at an abandoned Wampanoag village. I'm not sure if abandoned is the correct word. All the Wampanoags had died of disease brought by earlier settlers. The Pilgrims took advantage of the empty village left by this plague and found caches of corn and other Native American food stores buried along with the dead. This is how they survived the first winter. Here in Maine, the first recorded contact with Native Americans was from Giovanni Verrazzano. This was in 1523. He called Maine the land of the bad people. He asserted that the Indians would not trade with him face to face. They would only lower a basket over a cliff. This encounter is curious and makes one think that although this was the first recorded encounter, earlier encounters surely took place, and it wasn't very pleasant for the Wabanaki. Today, the Penobscot community where I live and work is on lockdown. Those of us who work for the tribe work from home. And just outside the church door, where that houses the statue of Kateri Tekakwitha, Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, is a small building called the Checkpoint. It is here where only Penobscot members are allowed onto our small island community. Thank you. Steve,
Yeah.
you have some questions?
Here we go. Hey, James, thank you so much for that kind of introduction and overview. It's hard to imagine, the foundation for the modern Wabanaki people is this complete devastation of population and lifestyle and process. And to me, it just has got to be the defining aspect, of who Wabanaki are today, kind of coming out of and recovering from that. Could you talk to us a little bit more about kind of the vibrancy and the community of the Wabanaki people spread around Maine prior to the Europeans' arrival? This rich culture and society that was here.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things you have to remember about our homeland, what we call now the state of Maine and into the Maritimes in Canada, is this is a very dynamic landscape that 13,000 years ago, where the state of Maine is now, was covered under 2 miles of ice. And since that point, that ice has receded and the landscape has changed dramatically in a very short amount of time, 13,000 years. And in that time, you have Wabanaki cultures living there. First across tundra-like landscapes, chasing down megafauna with swords, with spears and atlatls, and then as the region changed, rivers start appearing from the melting glaciers, and the forests start to change. So the land is rebounding. The people change along with the changing of the environments. And so we start to gain a great understanding of the landscape, a very sophisticated understanding. Penobscot in particular, as I mentioned in my opening, used to travel inland in kinship groups in the fall. And this was because all of us living as a one tribe couldn't live in one village because the surrounding area couldn't feed all of us. And so we would break up into these kinship bands and go hunt and gather year after year in the same places, returning to fishing spots in the spring and then on to the coast where there was a plethora of food in shellfish and other sea um, animals. So through that interaction with a vast area of land, um, we gained a great knowledge of that land. And early explorers obviously take advantage of this, asking us to guide them up the rivers. And a lot of these early explorers are trying to find a Northwest Passage. Same thing Lewis and Clark were looking for. Evidently, Christopher Columbus bumped into something that shouldn't have been there, the Americas. And so there's a big desire to go around, and it's never really solved until the Panama Canal, incidentally. And but it's important to understand that in our culture, it really was interaction with the environment and paddling birch bark canoes and birch bark wigwams for housing. And when you killed an animal, you paid a great amount of respect to that animal, because our stories tell us that Glooskap, our cultural hero, shot an arrow into an ash tree, and that ash tree split open. Same tree that we make baskets from. It splits open and creates all the animals of the landscape, including people. And so when you think about that creation story, that people were created at the same time as that moose, that doesn't give us the right to just indiscriminately kill that moose. It's almost like a predetermined deal with that moose that, okay, you're going to give your life up for our family so we can eat. But in return, I respect you, I'll thank you, I'll use every piece of your body that I can so that your spirit may live on. So there was a connection there, using that animal's fur for clothing, using its bones for needles or tools, using its innards for sinew. Delicacy was the tongue and the lips. Even in the case of tanning the hides, you'd use the brain of the animal to tan the hide. And so everything had its use. And so that's how we kind of proceeded with our neighbors, the critters in the forest. I mean, I could go on and on, Steve.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, but that I think that paints a really useful just sense of picture of balance and stability and vitality. You're talking about how much the land will bear. So there's a natural kind of living in relationship to what the land can sustain. So there's a balance there. Earlier today, we had an interesting conversation, and you were just talking about the vulnerability to these new microbes, these new pathogens that were brought over, and some of the reasons they had such a devastating impact. Can you talk a little bit about the exposure and the vulnerability based on separation, and then the lifestyle and the geography?
Sure. I mean, it really goes back to the carrying capacity of the land. Here we are. We're living in an existence that requires us to harvest the bounty of the forest, whether that's in animals or fruits or nuts or whatever's there. And the reason why we spread out on the land is so that there was enough of that bounty to go around. And so that model itself kind of puts a natural limitation upon population, first of all. Meanwhile, in Europe, they're living in large city-states. They're living on top of each other, dealing with the human waste problem, and going through things like the plague. Also, they're practicing animal husbandry, and pigs and cows and chickens and the like, all horses, oxen, all the beasts of burden, these animals that we use to power the agricultural machine. And a lot of their diseases come from that. And they spend generations upon generations in that sort of environment, and passing down immunity to their offspring. Now, Jared Diamond wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he relates something that I find very interesting about the Americas versus Eurasia. And why was it Eurasia that became civilized and took on agriculture and was able to live in city states, and what he was talking about was the orientation upon the globe that Eurasia is compared to the Americas. And what he was saying was that in Eurasia, you have these long lines of latitude that, because they're east-west, that you got a long distance of the same latitude, the same climate, the same growing season. And there could be a transmission of that same plant across that whole area. But also transmission of ideas from different cultures. You think about the Silk Road and those trade routes that go all the way into China. And in the Americas, you have a very short latitude set of lines that to travel great distances in the Americas, you got to cut across different climate zones. You got to go, north and south, which from very cold at the top to very, warm at the center, and then it get very cold at the bottom again. And so there's really not that ideal of peopling and growth that could be in Eurasia. And he also talks about the animals that could be domesticated for, as beast of burden, that there's only one animal in the Americas, and that was the South and Central American llama that has been used as some sort of animal for our use. And, any horses, oxen, any of those kind of animals come from Europe. And also an animal that came from Europe that was really devastating as far as epidemics was the rats that came over on the ships, the disease-carrying rats. Those were an introduction to the what they call the New World. But it's the geography is very, very important in that.
And you were also talking about the transmission. So you have those first interactions with the Europeans on the coast, during summertime when folks are gathered. You talk a little bit more about how the transmission across the community and within Maine, how that might have happened.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that, if you think about how we are all divided up, and we didn't all go to the coast to one single beach to, so this happens slowly over time that you get this group of people who become ill, and then maybe someone canoes over to the adjacent beach because there's a young lady over there that he really likes. But there's also trade networks going on, not only just within Wabanaki country, but all the way down to southern New England, where we were taking furs, especially after colonial period, taking furs down there in exchange for like corn, a commodity that was pretty plentiful down there that we didn't have much, kind of east and north of the Kennebec River. The soils just aren't very good for growing corn here. It's not that we didn't know about it. It's just not a good soil. So we used to trade for it. And so through those trade networks, you find that there's a lot of transmission of, a disease such as that.
So you were talking about the the balance and what the land will support. The culture in the community also requires kind of a division of labor and a sharing of responsibility. Can you talk more about how, you know, the hunting, the agricultural, the domestic, the child, all of those pieces fit together and required the numbers and the population that existed in the community, and so how then all of a sudden you had these vast and devastating losses in numbers, and how that just kind of took the infrastructure and the support that the whole community and culture required away, essentially.
Well, when you think about just, so the men would go out hunting, and they'd kill a deer, and to bring that deer in wasn't their responsibility. That was a harvest. So once it was killed, the women would go and gather up the moose meat and bring it back into camp. And they would take that deer and they would gut it and they would prepare the meat and they would dry or smoke the meat. They would prepare the bones. Also, someone could have some clothing. Maybe there was a woman who was good at sewing the clothes, making moccasins. So each person would have a specific job. Maybe someone who was particularly good at pounding ash. And, you know, we talk about this idea of takes many hands to make a basket. It's not just that cute little old lady sitting at a table at the arts fair selling the basket. It was, you know, her grandson who went and cut the ash down, her nephew that pounded the ash, her son who split and gauged the ash, and you know, and then, you know, her and her daughters braided the sweetgrass after her mother went and got the sweetgrass. And so there's this whole host of division of labor where everybody contributes. And, you know, for Wabanaki society before contact, that's the norm, that everybody had their part and everybody knew their role. And when you come upon the devastating effects of 75 to 90% death due to disease, what do you do then? You know, so then you start to see an increase in beaver trapping, you know, because that beaver fur was the most valuable thing in the landscape, because they had to go to the truck house, the trade houses now, to go get guns and ammunition, because, you know, my nephew used to make the arrowheads and the you know, the arrows, and he's not here anymore. I could probably do it myself, but he was way more efficient. So there becomes a reliance after that on European goods, and that kind of trade economy starts to really start to solidify within the frontier of Maine at that time.
So, dependency, the kind of the fabric is kind of blown up. Can you talk a little bit about then just the kind of process of survival adaptation, if that's the right word, you know, after, you know, by the time of the settling of Maine, and Maine's really getting populated, and you get to approach that period of statehood again, which people are paying attention to, how, you know, in what kind of pockets and structure were Wabanaki communities surviving, adapting, trying to get along at this moment where all of a sudden, you know, Maine's European identity is emerging? You know, can you talk about how we went from that contact and devastation to kind of to that period of settlement and Maine becoming a state, and it kind of growing, you know, the foundations of modern Maine in a sense?
Well, initially, you know, you had things like, you know, Wabanaki people being guides for, you know, early explorers. They knew the river systems, that they were doing that. But you also have to remember that, you know, I mentioned the Pilgrims and, you know, the Massasoits, kind of the the Thanksgiving chief who comes in and, throws deer carcasses on the table, and they all eat plentiful. And there's this whole Thanksgiving that takes place that a generation later, his son, named Metacom, also known as King Philip, starts a war in Massachusetts in 1675. And that trickles down into Maine, or trickles up into Maine, where there's an order sent out to all the truck houses and the trade houses not to deal with Native Americans, not to deal. They've gone crazy down here. They caused a war, and so you can really see the English and Wampanoag relationship that was so touted every Thanksgiving really deteriorates only in that one generation, and that trickles down into Maine. And so here in Maine, a bunch of starving Wabanaki people storm a trade house on Aroostook Island because they needed food and they needed guns to shoot the animals that they had at that point were relying on. And so when they were cut off because of what happened in southern New England, it really affects our ability to do that. And that's just the start. King Philip's War is just the start of about 100 years of, war in Maine between, between the French and the English. And, in particular, what the French consider, their colony ends at the Penobscot River, and what, British North America also at the Penobscot River. So it becomes this, you think it would be an easy boundary, but it wasn't. It was actually, it was contested, quite heavily contested. And so there's a lot of warring going on, and Wabanaki people have to take a side. And, all leading up to the French and Indian War. And, it's, they always say that the victors kind of named the war. And it wasn't a war, French against the Indians. It was the English who won against the French and their allied Indians, the Wabanaki, who lost the war. And so a lot of turmoil during those times, and a lot of colonization, and a lot of depopulation of much of the state of Maine. If you look at where reservations are in Maine, there are none in southern Maine. I think the one furthest south, I would probably Penobscot in Old Town. And but if you draw a line between that community here in Old Town and Odanak, which is in Canada, we're kind of like on the fringe of, there's Wabanaki communities to the north and the east of us from here, but really none to the south of us. And those people don't disappear. They make their way to an Indian community, and they're integrated into that community because we need people. And so, all that's kind of going on. So a lot of turmoil, and, really trying to figure out how to do this. But there's a certain consolidation for Penobscot people in that here we have, the Penobscot watershed and adjacent watersheds were probably our homeland, and through treaties and through land dispossession, we're consolidated down in 1796 to all the islands in the Penobscot River north of head of tide, and 6 miles on each side of the river. And then by 1818, that 6 miles on each side of the river is gone, and we're just left with the islands in the river and 4 upper townships and like 3 acres in Brewer. And so then that's what Maine adopts, that treaty. They actually ratified that treaty in 1820, and take over responsibility for what was spelled out in that treaty with the Penobscots from Massachusetts. And one of the things the state of Maine does is take control of the native populations. The first legislature said that they will be wards of the state. We will control them. We will assign an Indian agent to go to their communities. And, if they make any money off lands or leasing of lands, we will control that, the state of Maine. And so the state of Maine sells off our 4 upper townships. And who knows what happens to those 3 acres in Brewer. That's kind of lost to history. But it sets up this long relationship with the state of Maine, and a not so good one either, really. You talk about the piece that I did, for the exhibition, and the thing about that was, there was that was a proclamation from 1755, and that proclamation was issued by Spencer Phipps, and Spencer Phipps was the here it is right here. Spencer Phipps was the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, and he writes in here that he puts a bounty on Penobscot people's heads. He puts a price on it. This is actually a document of genocide. So it's a really ugly history starting in the colonial period, but this extends into statehood clearly. And, the state of Maine, making us wards of the states became quite a problem. Here's the painting that I did for there. Now, this is that same document. I actually painted it word for word. Every line, every character, painted, recreated the document. But then I wrote in Penobscots across the document in blood red, a word that means we walk on eternally. And in the exhibit, I asked the people of the state of Maine to join us and walk with us, because we're not going anywhere. And so we kind of have a lot of historical trauma within our community that we have to deal with. That wardship of the state only ends in the 1970s, so within my lifetime. So, and I'm 50, so that's not very long ago. And I think that one thing that we had talked about today, Steve, that I said I probably wouldn't want to talk about, but I think we can, is how this current pandemic is affecting our community. If you want to save that till the end, I understand if you have some other questions, but I do want to tell you I will address some of that. But I think there's some questions in the queue.
Yeah, no, I think it's appropriate to go there. But one of the things that I'm struck by is just what a direct and efficient line you've driven in this, in the last hour, kind of from the community and the culture that was here to the pandemic, to how it played out to being treated as wards of the state and given this narrow slice of the homeland, and to have that erode over time. It is just such a direct line to this kind of history and trauma that we're responsible for kind of contending with today. And I think just for the audience sake, if you have the chance to visit State of Mind, it looks at some of that story of that taking of the lands and the trauma and the genocide and the bounties. It really it paints a pretty searing picture. So I think it would be great for you to bring it to the present, a community and a culture and a people who have borne this trauma of a pandemic for all of this time. The perspective and the experience today, I think, would be really interesting for folks.
One thing that we've never given up on was the river. We're still on the river. We're fight for the river today. What's interesting is as you look at the history of our relationship with the state of Maine, with Indian agents who have taken it upon themselves, the state, to take that paternalistic control over the tribes, that you see in the 1950s in the Bangor Daily News and other newspapers in the state. There's a series of articles that went out that called the reservations in Maine rural slums. You hear on Indian Island, we didn't have water pipes until the early 1970s in this community. And in the 1950s, they're calling it rural slums. And that isn't on us as a community. That's on the state, because they were the ones holding the purse strings. They were the ones who collected all the money we had earned during the log drive when logging companies were chaining their logs to our islands. We made a lot of money. And what's a real shame is that a lot of people in Maine thought the Indians were just on welfare. That wasn't the case at all. It's that the state took that money through the Indian agents and then divvied it out to tribal members as they saw fit. Where our museum is today is the old Indian agent's office. And when we got federal recognition and we cut those ties with the state of Maine in the 1970s, the tribe took that building over, and we have since moved our museum in there. So there's a long and what's problematic today is that because that kind of severing with the state happened so recently, we kind of still live in the shadow of that. There is still in the hearts and the minds of the people of Maine that Indians are welfare cases, that they're less than, or they're alcoholic, or, and when the land claims happened in the 1980s, that really stirred up a lot of racial divide. You can go down to Lewiston and go in the Muskie archives, and you can read letters to Senator Muskie from people who were scared that they were going to lose their land. But so there's a long history of historical trauma between the state and the tribes, and that's why I wanted to do that piece. And that painting, that's a document from 1755 that even predates the United States. So that's a colonial document. And what I'm asking people of the state of Maine is that we're not going anywhere. We survived that act of genocide. We survived their paternalistic control, even though, they probably didn't want us to, but we're not going anywhere. We're going to walk on eternally, and to walk hand in hand with us. And that's why I think it's so important to be a part of the Maine Historical Society, to be here tonight, to educate people.
James, it's a fascinating process too, institutionally. As an old Yankee organization that was founded in 1822, 2 years after Maine became a state, by the founders of Maine, who were, responsible for so much of this. One of the strengths of our collection is this documentation of land development, acquisition, use, and distribution, going back to, through this whole entire period. And it's been fascinating, through Holding Up the Sky, through Lisa Brooks's research, to look back into those documents, which were seen to tell one story about, of triumph, success, and progress on one hand, and looking and kind of pulling out and really identifying the full impact of these stories. I think this just all points to the importance, as we kind of look at where we are today and Maine is today, of kind of unpacking and understanding the dimensions of this history. I want to, so it's interesting. I want to get to some of the audience questions in a moment, but, so it's interesting. I think, at Maine Historical, so much of our interest and our thoughts about the importance of history are about how it shapes us today and the issues we're grappling with today, and really where we all want to collectively take Maine in the future. The future is ours to define. As we are at this bicentennial moment, and as we're looking at the future to Maine, what are some of the issues, the opportunities, the needs that you think people should focus on in understanding this history and in dealing with it?
That's a really good question. I think we're in a really nice place these days, pandemic aside, that over the last, 5 years or so, that there's been since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the state, there's really been an upswing of people who are willing to look at the history from Native Americans' point of view, and to understand that there was historic trauma, understand that the wealth of this country was built on the theft of land and the enslavement of people. And I think we are, we were going in a really good place. As far as here in Maine, I think people are really interested in wanting to know about Native Americans and wanting to help. And the best place that they can go for that is an organization called, Wabanaki Reach. And it was actually Wabanaki Reach who insisted on the Truth and Reconciliation process. And so they are tasked with educating of people and to, deal with institutionalized racism, and to try to help them as, non-Native people to be effective allies, because in the past it was, what can we do for you, or some very patronizing kind of way, which wasn't very well received by the communities. And so Wabanaki Reach was really, and Maria Gerard, the director there, is a really excellent fellow historian from Maine, and my former boss here at the Penobscot Nation. But doing a lot of great work, and that's anybody's first step, is to go there first, and that's what it's there for. And there's a lot of people who want to be allies, and so yeah.
Their programs are fantastic, and a tremendous experiential way to really kind of explore and understand these issues.
Open eyes, right?
Yeah. So James, you were going to say something, I think you were going to say a little bit more about the current pandemic and how the community is responding to that or experiencing that.
Yeah, so right mid-March, it shut right down. All tribal employees are working from home except for essential people. Our clinic is, they're all still working. Dental appointments are emergency only. We have 3 facilities within our community that house our elders. those buildings are off limits to anybody but the people who live there. We have we've always had an elder meal program where we fed our elders lunch every day, hot meal at lunch every day. And they could go to the senior center and get that lunch. But if they were unable to go, we went Meals on Wheels and took it to them. And so we had that already in place. And so, the school kind of closed at the same time. And so we were delivering meals to anybody under 18 through the school every day, and to our elders, and that quickly went to anybody from the senior meal site. And so we've been cranking out food in our community to make sure that our people are taken care of. And those of us who don't take advantage of that, we don't go in the grocery store. We call and they deliver it out to the car. We really try to do those types of things. But there's a checkpoint at the bridge where you have to show your tribal ID to get on and get off. And that was implemented. We had a kind of a 2 clusters of people that had to go into quarantine because they had contact with somebody with coronavirus here in the community. We had a mother of a tribal member who got COVID early on. And then we had a tribal member who lived in Portland and one who lived in Florida. And those were early on. They were March, early April, all 3 of those. And then things got really quiet. There was no, people were getting tested. They were fine. And then, one thing about our community is culturally, gathering is really important to us. And there was some gathering around Halloween, and one of our food delivery workers wasn't feeling well one Friday afternoon, and by Sunday we had 15 people in quarantine and 2 positive cases. That really shook up, and this is just recently, that really shook everything up. And then so we've made arrangements to test everybody, absolutely everybody. The clinic is drive-through testing, and we're testing everybody. And out of the first round of testing, we now have 11 confirmed COVID cases in a community of 600 or so people. And so pretty scary times. I got a call from one of the people that one of the 2 people besides my wife that I've had contact in regularly, and he's a construction worker, and his boss's daughter is positive. And so he's not going to work anymore, and I'm not going to his house anymore for the time being. So, it's about taking those responsibilities. And I haven't been tested for COVID, but the community testing starts again tomorrow. I'll be in line. My wife will be in line. She got tested early because she went to a basket show, and like at the end of March. It was early on. She's a basket maker. I'm in her shop. I'm in her studio right now. But she's award-winning basket maker named Jennifer Neptune, and she went to Phoenix for a show and to demonstrate right at the beginning. And so when she came home, she got tested, and so she's going to get tested again. But it's it's amazing what this community's doing. It's really stepping up, and we have a lot of challenges. We Native American populations suffer more than any other community for things like diabetes and other illnesses, cancers. that plague us anyways. But it also makes this even worse. One of the reasons why we stop people from coming into the community is to protect not just our community, but our elders. And it's very hard because those elders, I miss them, as the tribe's historian. They're people I talk to on, every day. I used to go to senior meal sites and pay my $6 just to have lunch with them, just so I could learn and talk with them and laugh. That's not happening. And so it's really hard on the community. And we're just, holding out and praying and getting tested and staying safe.
James, you've done an incredible job of taking us from 13,000 years ago to the realities of today, November 11th in Maine, in really powerful ways. I really appreciate that. I want to kind of quickly go to speed round and try to get to some. I've been so consumed by our conversation to get some of the questions from the audience members out. So maybe we could just do a number of those kind of quickly.
Yeah.
And first of all, so somebody's already called me on, raised a pronunciation question and pointed out that we're pronouncing Wabanaki differently, of which I would put nothing in my own. So could you clarify pronunciation? Wabanaki?
Wabanaki?
Wabanaki.
Wabanaki.
Okay.
Wabanaki.
Yeah.
Wabanaki.
Everybody listen to James say it 2 more times and erase what you might have heard from me.
Wabanaki. Wabanaki.
Okay. There we go. Okay. James, a couple of people have asked about kind of the consciousness, the going back to the Great Dying, the weaponizing, the consciousness with which Europeans spread the diseases, the story of blankets consciously being passed. What's your knowledge or sense of that aspect of the story?
That gets brought up a lot. I think that there was zero initially, essentially here in Maine, the malicious intent on the Europeans. What happened was a product of environments clashing, and introduce a foreign species to a new environment. This stuff happens. The one that gets kicked around a lot in Indian country is the Amherst and the spreading of smallpox blankets, and that certainly happened. And this is at a time when the dealing with the Indian problem here in America was pretty prevalent, whether it was boarding schools or allotment acts. Whether it was the depopulation or the deculturalization of Native groups, it was pretty active by the federal government to kind of deal with what they call the Indian problem. And so, but I'm not even sure what the date was on those Amherst blankets, but it certainly wasn't widespread, definitely. And when I think and talk about the pandemics, it's on a science kind of base. This is what happened. This is how it went down. We had no immunities at all to fight this, and it devastated our communities.
Let's see. A couple of people have asked too. Do you have a sense, numbers-wise, population-wise, of the Wabanaki in prior to contact, even remotely? No.
No, I mean you can get your PhD on exploring this question. It's here in Maine, you really have to think about that model about how Native Americans are living and spread out on the landscape, and people have done this, and they do the math and okay, how many people per hectare or whatever, and then you can kind of extrapolate from that. But you got to people all the rivers. It's just not the Penobscot, and the Kennebec doesn't have no Indians. Well, they did, and the Androscoggin did, and the Saco and the Royal, and all the rivers up and down, and feeding the Gulf of Maine, certainly. So, yeah, population, that is such a nut to crack. I'm not even gonna. It's so wide ranging. The numbers are astronomically different when you look at different people's assertions.
Okay, James. So maybe we'll end with one, and we'll bring it back personally. Folks have asked, could you just talk a little bit about your background, your growing up, your family, you're becoming a historian? I like this because it brings it back around to historians and how we get here. So could you tell us just a little bit more about your background?
So I grew up here on Indian Island, but I wasn't born here. I actually, I'm reminded of there's a song by Elton John, Yellow Brick Road. When are you going to come down? When are you going to land? I should have stayed on the farm. I should have listened to my old man. When I hear that song, I'm brought back in time. I was probably 3 or 4 years old. My mom had gathered up my older brother, myself, and my younger sister, put us in a small moving van as she left Massachusetts, leaving my father, and she headed up, Route 1 and was crossing Tobin Bridge. And that's what I see at nighttime on Tobin Bridge. She must have turned up the radio when this song came on, because I can see her lips singing, You Can't Hold Me Forever. And I find the song to be a real gift, because it signifies the first time I ever went home, the first time I had been to Indian Island. And so by dawn, we were pulling into my grandmother's house, who lives just up the road. She died in 1990, but I grew up there for a few years. It was home of an elderly woman who was legally blind in one eye and completely blind in the other, who braided sweetgrass for a living. And her house always smelled like wonderful sweetgrass, and people would come to the house, and she was a speaker. And she raised like 11 wonderful kids. And so then my mom got her own house, and she was a single mom till I was 12 when she met my stepdad. I was a runner when I was a youth, ran in the National Cross Country Championships when I was 10, and ran in high school. But when I was 10 years old, I was chumming around with the gentleman who's our chief now. He's was my best friend growing up. We're the same age, and he grew up in the next house from here. Actually 2 houses from here, because the house right next door was a little house that had a sign on it that said Wounded Knee. And I was like, what does that mean? I was asking him. He goes, I don't know, go ask. And so we headed down over the hill, and we knocked on her door, and I asked her, and he had taken off by this time. And oh, come in. And so she shared a story about what that meant and what it meant to us, a tribe here in Maine that has a sign that says Wounded Knee on it. But that started a relationship with this elder, and she used to tell me stories. It's one of the first times that I remember being interested in history. And so when my grandmother died in 1990, I was home on leave from the Air Force, and I had to make a decision whether I was going to re-enlist or not. And she had told me that I had been given a gift, and I had to find a way to get back. And so, I was always confused about this gift. And, the only gift I ever really remember her giving me was when I was 13. She gave me a pair of Spider-Man underoos, and which wouldn't be so bad, but I was a little old for them. I don't know if you know what underoos were. They were like superhero inspired.
We're the same age.
Yeah. Well, I had an older brother who was 2 years older than me, and he stayed back in the 8th grade, and I skipped a grade. So we ended up going to high school together. And he knew I got these for my birthday. And so in high school, he would like look me up and down and call me Spidey. And so that's the only gift I ever really remembered for a long time. But I realized over time that she was talking about this relationship with this elder. I kind of joke about the underoos, but in all seriousness, that's my track as a historian began when I was 10. So I've spent 40 years reading and trying to understand this small little community in the Penobscot River of Maine. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, we owe you such a debt of appreciation for your work, your knowledge, and your willingness to share it with us. For folks in our audience, there are a lot of resources for learning more. It includes Wabanaki Reach, as James has mentioned. The Abbey Museum has incredible resources. If you look on our Maine Memory Network, there are more and more sources, including versions of the Holding Up the Sky exhibit and the State of Mind exhibit. And for some perspective on the bicentennial, I hope maybe you'll get to come see State of Mind because I think it tells a pretty complex story of statehood. We also, we didn't get to everybody's questions. We'll try to include any answers that we can glean from them and post them with the recording of this when this goes up shortly in the next week or two. But I really want to thank everybody for their interest, their participation, their commitment to Maine. And James, I just can't thank you enough, not just for tonight's program, but your ongoing collaboration and the way you enrich everything that we're doing. And this whole world works because of partnership and collaboration and perspectives and knowledge that we all share. And we just feel very fortunate to benefit from everything you've shared with us. So thank you.
Thank you.
And to all, a good night, and everybody be safe and take it from there. And thanks to our veterans.
Happy Veterans Day.
Happy Veterans
To all
Day.
veterans.